Why does Hollywood keep feeding us the same boring submarine movies while hiding the actual masterpieces? Everyone praises U-57D1 or Das Boot, but let's be honest. Most popular sub-films are overrated propaganda. Today, we are exposing the truth. Here are 18 forgotten submarine movies so brilliant, you will literally be angry that nobody talks about them. The Enemy Below, 1957. This World War II thriller is a masterclass in psychological tension, pitting an American destroyer captain against a German U-boat commander. The film is not just about naval warfare. It is a deeply respectful character study of two men doing their duty on opposite sides of a brutal war. The narrative unfolds like a high-stakes chess match in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, proving that intelligence matters more than brute force. It remains a towering achievement. What happens in the movie is a relentless game of cat and mouse. The American captain, played by Robert Mitchum, uses clever tactics to hunt down the elusive German sub, commanded by Kurt Jürgens. Both men constantly outsmart each other with sonar pings, depth charges, and deceptive maneuvers. As the battle drags on, the exhaustion builds, and the hunters become the hunted in a gripping cycle of underwater warfare that keeps you guessing until the final moments. The most famous scene occurs when the U-boat is heavily damaged and forced to surface right in the path of the American destroyer. Instead of immediately opening fire, both commanders share a brief, silent moment of mutual respect across the water. It is a powerful anti-war statement that humanizes the enemy. The scene culminates in both crews abandoning their doomed vessels, ultimately working together to survive after an explosive collision destroys both ships. It is completely absurd that this film is overlooked today. It won an Academy Award for Best Special Effects and perfectly balanced action with deep philosophical questions. While modern submarine movies rely on loud explosions, this forgotten classic uses pure suspense to create a flawless, unforgettable cinematic experience that puts modern Hollywood blockbusters to absolute shame with its sheer brilliance and tactical realism. Run Silent, Run Deep, 1958. Based on a best-selling novel by a real submarine commander, this film delivers a raw, claustrophobic look at the United States Navy's Pacific campaign. Starring Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster, the movie explores the dangerous obsession of a captain seeking revenge against a specific Japanese destroyer. It is a gritty, no-nonsense portrayal of submarine warfare that refuses to glamorize the horrific conditions inside a steel tube submerged thousands of feet underwater. The black and white cinematography only adds to the harsh realism. The plot follows the USS Nurka as it embarks on a highly unauthorized patrol. Gable's character, Captain Richardson, is haunted by a previous engagement where his submarine was destroyed. He blatantly ignores standard naval protocols, risking his crew and his executive officer, Lieutenant Jim Bledsoe, played by Lancaster. Tension boils over inside the cramped vessel as the crew questions their captain's sanity. Richardson pushes them into the dangerous Bungo Strait, executing a radical new tactic to finally sink the Japanese destroyer. The famous scene that leaves audiences breathless takes place during the climax in the Bungo Strait. Richardson orders the submarine to sit completely still on the ocean floor, playing dead to lure the enemy destroyer directly overhead. The tension is suffocating as the enemy drops depth charges that rock the sub violently. When the Japanese ship finally passes directly above them, Richardson fires a devastating spread of torpedoes straight up into its hull, achieving his ultimate revenge. This movie is unfairly forgotten simply because it came out the same year as other massive war epics. However, its intense focus on leadership, mutiny, and the terrifying reality of underwater combat makes it an absolute must-watch for any serious fan of military cinema. The Bedford Incident, 1965. This Cold War thriller is a terrifying exercise in paranoia and the dangers of blind military aggression. Unlike standard war movies, there are no actual battles here, only the escalating, suffocating threat of one. Richard Widmark plays a fanatical American destroyer captain who becomes unhealthily obsessed with hunting down a Soviet submarine near the Arctic Circle. The film serves as a chilling warning about how easily nuclear annihilation can be triggered by human ego. The story unfolds entirely on the American ship, where a liberal journalist, played by Sidney Poitier, is embedded to write a profile on the crew. He quickly realizes that Captain Finlander is a dangerous man who provokes the Soviet sub relentlessly, pushing them closer to a breaking point. The Soviet submarine is trapped under the ice, and Finlander refuses to let it escape. The crew becomes increasingly stressed as the captain's reckless actions make a peaceful resolution completely impossible. The most famous and shocking scene happens at the very end of the film. The American ship has the Soviet submarine cornered, and the sonar operator, driven to the edge of a nervous breakdown by Finlander's pressure, accidentally shouts that a missile has been launched. In a knee-jerk reaction, Finlander immediately orders a nuclear depth charge drop. The journalist screams that nothing was launched, but it is too late. The screen cuts to white, implying total nuclear destruction. It is a genuine tragedy that modern audiences ignore this film. It captures the absolute madness of Cold War paranoia better than almost any other movie. By relying on psychological dread instead of action sequences, it delivers a devastating ending that will haunt you long after the credits roll. Ice Station Zebra, 1968. Directed by John Sturges and starring Rock Hudson, this Cold War espionage thriller is a brilliant mix of submarine mechanics and spy fiction. The film is loosely based on real events and follows a tense mission to rescue a scientific team trapped in the Arctic. However, the plot quickly twists into a complex web of sabotage, double agents, and nuclear secrets. It is a slow-burn mystery that treats its submarine setting with absolute technical respect. Every single scene feels meticulously crafted. What happens in the movie is a high-stakes race against Soviet forces. Commander Faraday takes his nuclear submarine, the USS Tigerfish, into the treacherous, ice-choked waters of the North Pole. Aboard are a secretive British agent and a defecting Soviet scientist. As they battle mechanical failures and crashing ice sheets, they discover that the downed weather station actually contains a crashed Soviet satellite filled with top-secret film canisters. A hidden saboteur aboard the sub is trying to stop them from retrieving it. The most famous scene features the submarine desperately trying to surface through the thick Arctic ice pack. The hull groans under the immense pressure of the freezing ocean. The captain orders full reverse power, and the submarine violently breaks through the ice crust, sending massive chunks of frozen water crashing onto the deck. It was an incredibly expensive and physically built set that looked breathtakingly real, perfectly capturing the deadly, crushing power of the polar environment. Howard Hughes famously loved this movie so much that he watched it hundreds of times in his later years. Despite that insane level of historical endorsement, modern viewers barely remember it. It is a smart, beautifully shot submarine puzzle that deserves far more attention for its unique Arctic espionage storyline. Assault on a Queen, 1966. This utterly bizarre and fascinating heist movie asks a ridiculous question. What if you used a submarine to rob a luxury ocean liner? Starring Frank Sinatra as a disgraced naval officer, the film combines oceanic adventure with classic crime thriller elements. It is a highly stylized, slightly absurd premise that somehow works brilliantly because it commits fully to its own weird logic. It is a totally unique entry in the submarine genre that defies all traditional expectations. The tension is simply fantastic. The plot follows Mark Britton, a down-on-his-luck captain who recruits a ragtag group of mercenaries. They manage to salvage a derelict German U-boat from the ocean floor and secretly repair it. Their target is the RMS Queen Mary, a massive passenger ship crossing the Atlantic. Britton plans to pull alongside the luxury liner, board it with his armed crew, and extort millions of dollars from the wealthy passengers. The tension comes from the incredibly risky maneuver of surfacing directly next to a huge, fast-moving target. The famous scene is the actual assault itself. The dark, rusted U-boat suddenly rises out of the foggy night ocean, right beside the brightly lit, glamorous Queen Mary. Sinatra and his men fire a dummy torpedo into the side of the liner to prove they have weapons, then board the ship using grappling hooks. The visual contrast between the elegant passengers in tuxedos and the heavily armed, wet criminals emerging from a submarine creates an unforgettable, surreal cinematic moment. Critics completely dismissed this movie upon release, calling the plot too ridiculous to take seriously. But that is exactly why it is so entertaining today. It is a stylish, wildly imaginative caper film that takes the submarine out of wartime and places it into a fun, criminal underworld where it absolutely does not belong, making it a wildly fun watch. Torpedo Run, 1958, starring Glenn Ford. This intense World War II film explores the dark moral compromises of submarine warfare. it does not shy away from showing the horrific collateral damage caused by torpedo strikes. Ford plays Commander Barney Doyle, a hardened submarine captain tasked with crippling Japanese supply lines in the Pacific. The film is remarkably darker than most propaganda films of its era, offering a bleak look at the psychological toll of sending men to a watery grave. The story revolves around Doyle's obsessive mission to sink a massive Japanese aircraft carrier that is heavily protected by a destroyer escort. During a daring attack, Doyle manages to torpedo the carrier, but the escort destroyer maneuvers into the path of the torpedoes and is blown up instead. Doyle later discovers that Allied prisoners of war, including his own wife and child, were being transported on that very destroyer. He is forced to confront the devastating consequences of his own military orders. The most gut-wrenching scene occurs when Doyle's submarine surfaces near the wreckage of the destroyer he just sunk. Through his binoculars, he sees Allied prisoners struggling in the burning, oil-covered water. The realization hits him that his successful military strike has potentially killed his own family. Glenn Ford delivers a devastating, silent performance of pure agony as his crew watches helplessly, unable to rescue the men due to the risk of enemy aircraft spotting them. This movie is forgotten because audiences at the time found its anti-hero narrative too depressing. However, that exact darkness makes it a masterpiece. It refuses to treat war as a clean, heroic endeavor, instead showing the brutal, irreversible tragedies that happen when torpedoes leave their tubes. Grey Lady Down, 1978. This 1970s disaster film takes the classic submarine rescue formula and strips it down to pure, unadulterated tension. Starring Charlton Heston as the captain of the nuclear submarine USS Neptune, the movie focuses entirely on survival after a catastrophic accident. There are no enemies to fight here. The only villain is the crushing, unforgiving pressure of the deep ocean. It is a grounded, claustrophobic thriller that relies entirely on the realism of the rescue procedures. The pacing is deliberately slow, mirroring the real passage of time. What happens in the movie is a terrifying sequence of events. While evading a rogue Soviet submarine, the Neptune collides with a massive underwater landslide and plummets to the ocean floor, becoming trapped under hundreds of feet of jagged rock. The hull is breached, the boat is tilted at a dangerous angle, and the crew is running out of breathable air. On the surface, a desperate Navy rescue team, led by a stubborn submarine expert, must figure out how to reach the men before they suffocate. The most famous scene involves the incredibly risky use of a futuristic mini-submarine called the SR-1 to navigate through the narrow, jagged crevices of the rockfall. The tension is unbearable as the tiny rescue vehicle squeezes through tight underwater caves, risking getting permanently wedged or crushed. When the mini-sub finally reaches the crippled Neptune and establishes a physical connection to pump in fresh air, the relief felt by the trapped crew is incredibly powerful and emotionally resonant. It is a massive shame that this movie has faded into obscurity. Released the same year as Star Wars, it was completely overshadowed by science fiction. But for fans of realistic, high-stakes naval drama, it remains one of the most accurate and suspenseful submarine rescue movies ever put on screen. Hostile Waters, 1977. Based on a terrifying true story that was kept classified for decades, this made-for-television movie is far better than its small-screen origins suggest. Starring Rutger Hauer as a Soviet submarine captain, the film dramatizes a 1986 incident where a Soviet ballistic missile sub suffered a catastrophic missile tube explosion. It is a harrowing tale of Cold War secrecy, where the crew is forced to choose between dying and accepting help from their American enemies. The plot follows Captain Britanov, as his submarine, carrying dozens of nuclear warheads, experiences a massive explosion while on patrol. The blast rips a huge hole in the hull, causing flooding and a fire that threatens to detonate the nuclear missiles. The Soviet High Command, terrified of exposing their military failures, refuses to send help and orders the crew to abandon ship in freezing waters. Britanov disobeys orders, keeping his men aboard to desperately repair the ship while an American destroyer closely monitors them. The most famous and chilling scene occurs when the American captain, realizing the Soviet sub is in mortal danger, makes the controversial decision to offer direct assistance. Two navies that were prepared to annihilate each other just days before suddenly must work together. American sailors literally toss heavy welding equipment and high-pressure pumps across the churning ocean waves to the desperate Soviet crew, showcasing a bizarre moment of shared humanity amidst nuclear paranoia. Because it was a TV movie, it completely missed the cinematic spotlight. However, the factual accuracy and the sheer terror of a potential accidental nuclear detonation make it infinitely more compelling than most fictional submarine thrillers. It is a hidden gem that deserves a massive revival. Below, 2002. This movie is a brilliant, highly underrated mashup of two incredibly stressful genres: the World War II submarine movie and the supernatural horror film. Directed by David Twohy, the film takes place entirely inside the claustrophobic confines of the USS Tiger Shark. After rescuing survivors from a sunk hospital ship, the crew begins to experience terrifying, unexplainable phenomena. It is a creepy, atmospheric thriller that uses the inherent darkness of a submarine to maximum terrifying effect. What happens in the movie is a slow descent into madness. The submarine is depth-charged by a German destroyer, damaging the boat and killing the captain. The new commanding officer, Lieutenant Brees, takes command but acts incredibly suspiciously. Soon, the crew starts hearing strange noises, seeing ghosts in the shadows, and finding objects moving on their own. The female survivor they picked up begins investigating the crew's dark secrets, realizing that the submarine itself might be haunted by a terrible crime committed by the officers. The most famous scene involves a terrifying interaction with a phonograph record. A crew member puts on a Benny Goodman record to calm the nerves of the men. As the jazzy music plays, the record suddenly starts skipping on its own. The skipping forms a distinct, rhythmic pattern that the crew slowly realizes is a Morse code message from beyond the grave, directly accusing the officers of murder. It is an incredibly eerie, skin-crawling moment that perfectly blends naval technology with ghostly revenge. Horror fans and submarine enthusiasts alike completely missed this movie upon release due to terrible marketing. It is a shame because it is arguably the best ghost story set at sea. By trapping its characters in a steel tube with an unseen evil, it creates a uniquely terrifying, unforgettable horror experience. The Hunley, 1999. Long before nuclear reactors and torpedo tubes, submarine warfare was a primitive, deeply terrifying experiment. This historical drama stars Armand Assante as Lieutenant George Dixon, the commander of the CSS Hunley during the American Civil War. The film is a fascinating look at the very birth of underwater combat, highlighting the incredible bravery and sheer desperation of Confederate soldiers who volunteered to climb into a hand-cranked metal coffin to break a Union blockade. The sound design is particularly exceptional. The story details the tragic, repeated failures of the Confederate submarine program. The Hunley was essentially a modified steam boiler that sank 3 times during testing, killing its crews, including the inventor. Despite the obvious death trap it was, Dixon manages to recruit a new crew. They successfully demonstrate the submarine's ability to dive and navigate, earning the trust of the military. The climax follows their daring nighttime mission to attack the heavily armored Union ship, the USS Housatonic, using a primitive spar torpedo attached to the front. The most famous scene is the actual historical attack on the Housatonic. Shot from the perspective of the exhausted, cramping men inside the Hunley, the scene shows them manually cranking the propeller as fast as humanly possible while underwater. They drive the explosive spar directly into the wooden hull of the massive Union ship. The subsequent explosion is spectacular, successfully sinking the enemy vessel and making it the first submarine in history to destroy an enemy ship in combat. It is a complete mystery why this TV movie is so thoroughly ignored. The historical accuracy regarding the claustrophobic, grueling conditions of early submarine warfare is phenomenal. It honors the real-life pioneers of naval combat, who literally sacrificed their lives to change military history forever. Phantom, 2013. This gripping Cold War thriller boasts an incredible cast, including Ed Harris and David Duchovny, yet almost nobody has seen it. The film is inspired by the true, still-debated mystery of the K-129, a Soviet Gulf II-class submarine that sank in 1968. It departs from typical submarine movies by focusing heavily on a high-stakes political conspiracy and a rogue hijacking, turning the submarine into a floating battleground for ideological control rather than a simple war machine. What happens in the movie is a tense, paranoid atmosphere from the very beginning. Ed Harris plays Captain Demi, a veteran Soviet sailor on his final voyage before retirement. Shortly after departing, the submarine is boarded by a shadowy group of KGB agents led by Duchovny. Demi quickly realizes they have brought a secret device designed to mask the submarine's electronic signature, making it look like a Chinese vessel. The KGB plans to fire nuclear missiles at the American coast to trigger a war. The most famous and heartbreaking scene occurs when Captain Demi decides to sabotage the KGB plot to save the world. Knowing he cannot trust his own crew, Demi locks himself in the torpedo room to manually disable the nuclear warheads. The KGB agents violently try to breach the bulkhead. Demi calmly uses a wrench to smash the delicate arming mechanisms, bleeding heavily from his wounds, choosing his own death to prevent global nuclear annihilation. Released with practically zero marketing, this film sank at the box office, despite Harris giving one of the best performances of his career. It is a dense, intelligent thriller that respects the real-life mysteries of the Cold War. It deserves to be discovered by audiences who appreciate smart, character-driven espionage over mindless action. We Dive at Dawn, 1943. Made during the height of World War II, this British film offers a remarkably authentic, day-in-the-life perspective of a Royal Navy submarine crew. Unlike American war films that often focused on heroic individualism, this movie emphasizes teamwork, routine, and the quiet, boring moments between intense combat. Starring John Mills, it is a gritty, highly realistic portrayal of the everyday men who served in the silent service, making it an invaluable historical time capsule of wartime naval attitudes. It stands as a tribute to ordinary heroes. The plot follows the crew of the HMS Sea Tiger as they leave port for a routine patrol in the Baltic Sea. The film spends a significant amount of time showing the mundane aspects of submarine life, cooking in a tiny galley, sleeping in cramped bunks, and dealing with minor mechanical repairs. However, the routine is shattered when they receive orders to find and destroy a massive, heavily guarded German battleship, the Brandenburg. The crew must navigate dangerous minefields and enemy sonar nets to reach their target. The most famous scene takes place during the stealthy approach to the German battleship. The submarine is forced to sit silently on the ocean floor, while enemy destroyers drop depth charges directly above them. The camera stays inside the control room, focusing on the sweaty, tense faces of the crew as the explosions rock the boat. The tension breaks when they finally fire their torpedoes, and the crew quietly cheers as they hear the massive explosions hit the enemy ship through the water. Because it was created as wartime propaganda, many modern viewers wrongly dismiss it as a shallow relic. That is a huge mistake. Its focus on realism over melodrama makes it one of the most accurate depictions of British submarine life ever committed to film. Crash Dive, 1943, winning the Academy Award for Best Special Effects. This World War II film is a fascinating mix of naval combat and romantic drama, starring Tyrone Power as a strict submarine commander and Dana Andrews as his rebellious executive officer. The film cleverly uses a love triangle to explore the psychological stresses of submarine warfare. It is a polished, highly entertaining Hollywood production that perfectly captures the patriotic spirit of the era while delivering genuinely exciting underwater action sequences. What happens in the movie begins on land, where both officers fall in love with the same woman, a Navy nurse. To make matters worse, Andrews' character is transferred to Power's submarine, the USS Thunderfish. The personal tension spills into their professional duties, causing dangerous friction during patrols. Eventually, they must put their differences aside when the Thunderfish is tasked with a critical, highly dangerous mission to infiltrate a heavily defended Japanese harbor and gather intelligence that could change the course of the Pacific War. The most famous scene is the spectacular climax inside the Japanese harbor. The submarine is spotted by enemy patrol boats and forced to make a violent, emergency crash dive to avoid being rammed. As the sub plunges deep, the crew scrambles to seal the hatches, while Japanese depth charges explode all around them, violently shaking the vessel. The special effects team brilliantly used massive water tanks and miniature models to create a terrifyingly realistic sense of being crushed by the ocean, which rightfully earned them an Oscar. It is often overshadowed by later, grittier war films, but that does not make it any less great. It perfectly balances human drama with state-of-the-art 1940s action. For anyone who loves classic Hollywood cinema, combined with authentic submarine mechanics, this is an absolute must-see. Hell Below, 1933. This pre-code Hollywood classic is one of the very first movies to realistically portray submarine warfare, and it is surprisingly brutal for its time. Starring Robert Montgomery and Walter Houston, the film follows an American submarine in the Adriatic Sea during World War I. Because it was made before the strict enforcement of the Hays Code, the movie features a level of cynicism, violence, and moral ambiguity that feels incredibly modern compared to the sanitized war films that followed a few years later. The pacing is incredibly fast and never lets up. The story centers on a disgraced naval officer who is assigned to a submarine as punishment. He is bitter and resents his commanding officer, creating a toxic atmosphere on board. The submarine is sent on a dangerous mission to sink an Austrian battleship, but their plans go horribly wrong. They are depth-charged relentlessly, resulting in severe damage to the vessel. The crew is forced to make difficult, life-or-death decisions about who lives and who dies as the oxygen supply rapidly dwindles in the sinking, crippled boat. The most famous and shocking scene for its era involves a violent mutiny underwater. As the submarine sits broken on the seafloor, panic sets in. One of the crew members completely loses his mind, grabbing a wrench and attacking the captain in a frantic attempt to reach the limited supply of emergency oxygen. The raw, desperate violence of men fighting to the death in a tiny flooded room was highly controversial in 1933 and still packs a heavy punch today. Audiences today completely ignore early 1930s sound films, assuming they are clunky and outdated. This movie proves that theory entirely wrong. It is a fast-paced, dark, and technically impressive submarine thriller that laid the groundwork for every underwater movie that came after it. Submarine X1, 1968. This highly fictionalized British film tells the incredible, largely forgotten story of the Royal Navy's top-secret X-class midget submarines during World War II, starring James Caan as a disgraced American commander loaned to the British. The movie focuses on a seemingly impossible mission. These tiny, four-man submarines were specifically designed to sneak past heavy harbor defenses and attach massive explosive charges directly to the hull of enemy battleships, essentially turning the crews into suicide bombers. What happens in the movie follows Caan's character as he trains a small group of elite volunteers to operate these fragile, cramped vessels. The pacing is deliberately methodical, showing the grueling physical and mental preparation required for such a bizarre form of warfare. The climax details the real-life Operation Source, where the midget subs are towed across the North Sea and released near Norway. They must navigate treacherous currents and heavily guarded anti-submarine nets to reach the terrifying German battleship, the Tirpitz. The most famous scene occurs inside the midget submarine as it approaches the Tirpitz. The vessel is so small that the crew can hear the enemy ship's propellers through the thin steel hull. Working in complete darkness with only a compass and a stopwatch, they manually steer the sub underneath the massive warship. The tension is unbearable as they struggle to attach the heavy explosive charges to the battleship's belly before their own oxygen runs out and the submarine becomes a tomb. Because it uses a fictional American lead, history purists unfairly dismiss the film upon release. However, it brilliantly captures the insane bravery required for this specific type of naval sabotage. It is a unique, highly suspenseful look at a bizarre chapter of underwater warfare. Counterattack, 1945. This brilliant World War II thriller is essentially a locked-room mystery set entirely inside a sinking submarine. Starring Paul Muni and Marguerite Chapman, the film takes a highly unconventional approach to the genre by blending espionage with claustrophobic suspense. Instead of fighting enemy ships, the protagonists are trapped underwater with a deadly saboteur. It is a highly dialogue-driven, intellectually engaging puzzle that relies on paranoia and deduction rather than torpedo strikes and depth charges to generate its thrills. The direction is incredibly tight. The plot begins with a Soviet submarine heavily damaged by a Nazi destroyer and forced to take refuge on the ocean floor. The captain is dead, and the surviving crew discovers that someone on board is a German spy who deliberately caused the fatal malfunction. With limited oxygen and the hull groaning under pressure, a surviving Soviet officer and a female resistance fighter who was rescued from a lifeboat must interrogate the remaining crew members. They have to unmask the killer before the air runs out. The most famous scene is the intense, psychological interrogation sequence. The officer lines up the suspects in the cramped, dimly lit control room and systematically picks apart their alibis. The tension is incredibly high because the audience knows the spy is among them, watching and waiting for an opportunity to strike again. When the spy is finally exposed through a brilliant deduction regarding a specific piece of mechanical sabotage, a brutal, desperate hand-to-hand fight breaks out in the narrow corridors, threatening to rupture the already weakened hull. It is completely forgotten today, largely because it focuses on Soviet characters, which made it unpopular during the later Cold War era. That is a shame, as its clever script and fantastic use of confined space make it one of the smartest submarine mysteries ever produced. The Spy in Black, 1939. This magnificent early film from the legendary directing duo Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger is a masterful World War I espionage thriller, starring Conrad Veidt as a ruthless German U-boat commander. The film subverts expectations by focusing entirely on the enemy's perspective. It is a stylish, moody, and surprisingly sympathetic look at a dedicated soldier carrying out a dangerous mission in the Orkney Islands, proving that great submarine stories can thrive even without a single underwater battle scene. What happens in the movie is a tense game of deception. Veidt's character is smuggled onto a remote Scottish island by his submarine, with orders to gather intelligence on the British fleet. He assumes the identity of a schoolteacher and is aided by a local woman who is secretly a German spy. However, neither of them knows that the other is a fellow agent. As they unwittingly cross paths and accidentally sabotage each other's missions, British intelligence slowly closes in on their isolated location. The most famous scene happens at the very beginning and sets the entire tone for the film. The camera is positioned inside the dark, dripping, claustrophobic conning tower of the German U-boat as it surfaces at night in a Scottish bay. Veidt quietly climbs out into the thick fog, looking like a phantom emerging from the ocean. The striking visual contrast between the blackness of the submarine and the eerie, mist-shrouded Scottish landscape creates an iconic piece of cinema that perfectly establishes a mood of quiet dread. Because it lacks the typical explosive action associated with submarine movies, casual viewers often overlook it. However, its brilliant twist ending and atmospheric storytelling make it an absolute triumph of early wartime cinema. It is a smart, sophisticated thriller that demands your attention. Black Sea, 2014. This modern submarine thriller, directed by Kevin MacDonald, is a gritty, ruthless heist movie that completely subverts the typical military formula. Starring Jude Law as a recently fired submarine captain, the film throws away naval uniforms and replaces them with greedy, desperate mercenaries. It is a dark, violent, and highly entertaining throwback to classic treasure-hunting adventures, but it adds a brutal, modern edge by showing exactly how fast men will turn on each other when trapped underwater with millions of dollars in gold. The sound design is incredibly immersive. The plot kicks off when Law's character learns about a sunken Nazi U-boat at the bottom of the Black Sea containing a massive cargo of gold bullion. He secures funding from a shady businessman and hires a ragtag crew of half-British, half-Russian sailors. Tension is high from the start due to the language barrier and cultural hatred. As they reach the wreck and begin recovering the heavy gold, a series of catastrophic mechanical failures and betrayals turn the mission into a deadly fight for survival. The most famous and intense scene features a brutal mutiny over the gold. The submarine's airlock is damaged, trapping half the crew on the ocean floor inside the Nazi wreck, while the others remain on the main sub. Jude Law's character makes the chilling, sociopathic decision to sever the tethering rope, leaving his own men to drown in the dark water so there are fewer people to split the treasure with. It is a shocking, cold-blooded moment of pure greed. Despite being a highly effective, edge-of-your-seat thriller, this movie barely made a ripple at the box office. It is unfairly dismissed as a B-movie, but its incredible pacing, fantastic cast, and ruthless storytelling make it one of the best modern submarine films you have ever seen. Hollywood loves to remake the same tired stories, but as you just saw, the best submarine movies are the ones hiding in plain sight. These 18 films prove that you do not need a massive budget to create unbearable tension. If you actually love cinema, do yourself a favor and track these down. Which one are you watching first? Tell me in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more hidden cinematic gems.